Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you about cover crops and weeds, and really about weed diversity. So first, it's probably no surprise to all of you, but weed competition causes significant yield loss. This data here, this is from the Weed Science Society of America's yield loss reports, where they take production data from across the US and Canada and then estimate how much impact weed competition would potentially have on lost production value. So the data here, these are for soybean, maize, dry bean, and wheat, and these are data from Canada, but these numbers here are in US dollars. And so you can see in Canada, if we left weeds completely uncontrolled, we lose up to $1 billion US in total value. In corn, we're around $500 million, and then dry bean and wheat are quite a bit less, but still quite a significant amount of money is lost potentially due to weed competition. In the past, we've done a pretty good job of controlling weeds with herbicides, but this is a situation that producers are starting to face more frequently. This is a picture I took in Ontario 2 years ago of either probably Roundup Ready corn with basically Roundup Ready pigweed all through it. Almost certain that's some form of herbicide resistance, either to Roundup or a triazine product. That is the only other weed there, it's just pigweed and corn, and almost certainly you're not getting any yield out of that. These are some pictures that I've taken over the past couple of years across PEI. We're not really in situations like that I just showed you, but we do have, this is like a layer of pigweed, triazine resistant in potatoes. Here's a picture, Sencor applied a couple days ago, and some pretty happy little pigweeds sitting there, and a nice little row of pigweeds in a potato field. So we're not immune to that. So as we lose some of our herbicides, we need to develop kind of new tactics and new ways of approaching these things, because obviously some of our products are no longer working. So I really believe that to ensure the resiliency and ultimately the sustainability of weed management, there's a necessity to increase both the biodiversity and the diversity of our management tactics within our agro-ecosystems. That's a lot of buzzwords thrown in there, but hopefully I'll kind of break it down as we go forward. So how do cover crops fit into that story? When we're talking about diversity of management tactics, we're really talking about integrated weed management. And integrated weed management is not relying on single mechanisms of weed control, so not solely relying on herbicides, but it's combining aspects of chemical, biological, mechanical, and cultural control to really develop that holistic weed management toolbox. Traditionally, we think of cover crops as being cultural control. Cultural control is anything that makes our crop more competitive against our weeds. So when you use a cover crop, you're trying to choke your weeds out, let them germinate, but then kill them off, prevent seed set, all of these things, trying to really increase the competitiveness of your cropping system over your weeds. But I see cover crops fitting into all four of these different aspects. If you have like a lot of annual broadleaves, maybe you plant a perennial or a cover crop that's really tolerant of mowing, and you can go in and mow it off. Let the cover crop come back, and you've been able to potentially control some of your weeds there, prevent them from setting seed. Ryan just talked about biofumigant effects of cover crops, so there's more and more work showing that not only do some of these cover crops have effects on your verticillium and your nematodes, wireworms, that kind of thing, but also on weed seed germination. And so some of those cover crops that we can incorporate into the soil may either promote germination or essentially act like some of our herbicides do and prevent germination of weed seeds, as well as chemical control. So use some sort of pre-plant herbicide, a different mode of action that's in the rest of your rotation. You might use some sort of herbicide in season or a different herbicide mode of action to terminate that cover crop at the end of the season. And that's all about really preventative weed management. So that's the diversity of management tactics, but I want to talk about plant biodiversity for the rest of my talk here. So I want to try and convince you that weed diversity is good. People probably think I'm crazy when I say, yeah, no, it's okay to have weeds there. I'm not talking about massive amounts of weed biomass, just weed diversity. So weed diversity may be important for supporting agro-ecosystem function and services. These are kind of ecological terms. Ecologists talk about ecosystem services all the time. What does that actually mean? So reduced weed biodiversity has been correlated to declines in bird and insect populations. Those bird and insects, those could be important beneficial insects, birds that prey on weed seeds. There's some estimates that you can, birds may actually be removing up to 60% of weed seeds from our cropping systems every year. And if we remove all of those habitats for our birds and our insects, by killing all of our weeds, we might actually reduce their diversity and lose some of that ecosystem functioning. So we need high plant biodiversity to maintain those ecosystem functions, and I'll show you in a second that high weed biodiversity may actually in fact buffer against yield loss and maybe increase crop yields. So how do we measure plant biodiversity? So 3 just quick definitions. First, species richness. That is the raw number of species that are within an area. So you define your field, you count how many species are there, you're going to get a whole number, say 5 different things, that's your species richness. Then there's species density, and that's the abundance of a particular species within an area. You're probably all familiar. Lamb's quarters is at 10 plants per meter squared or something. Then the last thing here, Simpsons Index. This is a measure of plant diversity, and so it takes species richness and then the relative abundance of those species into account to give you a single number to say how diverse your community is or that area that you're working with. So the Simpsons Index measures diversity, and it can range in values from 0 to 1. And all that number tells you is that the probability of when you grab 2 different plants at random, that they're the same species. So if you have a value of 1, it means 100% of the time when you grab 2 plants, they're the same species. You have no diversity there. Contrast that with when you're down here around 0. Well, 0 would be infinite levels of diversity. You can't have that. But if you're down at 1%, it means every time you grab a plant, 1% of the time they're the same thing. So just to give you something visually, here we've got a diverse cover crop mixture. I think it's about 8 species in there, all in kind of equal balance in their relative abundance. So we've got a Simpsons Index approaching 0. Then we get here, we've got a 3-way mixture. That's hairy vetch, crimson clover, and annual rye. A lot more hairy vetch and crimson clover in there. So even though we have a species richness of 3, we don't actually have a super diverse community. And then we get over here, there's I think pearl millet, and that's a monoculture. So that would be Simpsons Index of 1 if we just looked at cover crops. So yeah, I have this down here, more diverse to least diverse. Kind of wherever I'm talking about Simpsons Index, I throw that up there just so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. So just some data from the literature. This is a study out of the UK on winter wheat yields. And so this is across 19 years. And here we've got the raw number of weed species recorded, so that's species richness, and then percent yield loss on the y-axis there. So you can see a pretty sharp decline as you record more number of weed species. And that's a decline in yield loss. So winter wheat yield loss was greatest when weed species diversity was lowest. So here around 5, 6, 7 species, we're approaching 60 to 70% yield loss. And then down at the other end, when we're getting to 20 species, we're at 10% yield loss. This was not a weed control study. I think this was a nitrogen study, but that just happened to be something that came out of the data as they were looking over it. Just another example from this side of the ocean, soybean yield increased with increasing weed diversity in a long-term study in Michigan. So this was looking at, I can't remember how many years, but soybean yield, and they measured diversity. So you've got the same kind of measure there, more diverse to least diverse. And they found that the soybean yield was greatest under the most diverse wheat community, and that soybean production risk was highest under the least diverse community. So here, this is increase in yield, and as this goes up, or it goes up as we approach more diversity. And directly from their paper, they said that each additional species lost from our agro-ecosystem had a progressively greater negative effect on yield. So this is not a linear relationship, this is like really an exponential relationship. So can we use plant diversity to decrease the negative effects of weeds on crop yield? So now I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working with, funded by the Atlantic Grains Council. We're evaluating 20 different cover crop species in monocultures, as well as then in 2- and 3-way mixtures. We're evaluating kind of the in-season effects on weeds, disease, insects, soil health parameters, as well as the carryover effect on subsequent barley and soybean yields. So we're in the middle of this right now, so I'm just going to be presenting really the effects on the weed biomass, and then the yield numbers kind of got hit by hurricane this year, so they're kind of skewed, so I'm not really going to talk about those right now. So first, not surprisingly, weed biomass declines as cover crop biomass increases, but there may be diminishing returns. So here we've got cover crop biomass on the y-axis and then weed biomass on the x-axis. And this is within the one season. So this is 2 years worth of data, but we're looking at the weed biomass in the cover crop year. And so you can see at really low levels of cover crop biomass, we have a ton of weeds. But this kind of gradually declines until you get around here, right around 300 grams per meter square, and then it maybe climbs up a little bit again. Haven't really dug down into this. I think maybe what's happening is you're getting some kind of self-thinning or competitive interactions between your cover crop. When you have that much biomass there, you might getting some like inhibition on itself. This is the list of all the different species we're evaluating. I've grouped them all into kind of their functional groups. So here we've got red soil, that's our control, that's just bare ground for the season. Then we've got a brassicas here, forbs here in green, grasses in yellow, legumes in purple. Then we've got two-way mixtures of different functional groups in orange, and then three-way mixtures of different functional groups in gray. And then this McCain mix, which I think is 10 different species in there. So you can see there's a lot of variability in their different cover crop species' ability to suppress weeds. Really no trends we see amongst certain groups being really good at suppressing weeds. Some of them kind of, not surprising, buckwheat, phacelia, a mix of the two of them, oat, pearl millet, all really good, fast growing, suppress a lot of weed biomass and prevent weeds from establishing. But yeah, so really a lot of variability in different cover crop ability, or species' ability to suppress weeds. Now, getting over to the diversity side of things, here we have the Simpsons Index, so going from most diverse to least diverse, and then weed biomass. And again, this is within season. And we've got three different lines here. The orange line is the cover crop diversity, the blue line is the weed diversity, and then the green line is the diversity of everything that's there, so the plant and the weed diversity. So you're getting a picture of overall plant diversity. And what we can see is that as we move towards a least diverse weed community, we have a lot more weed biomass. So this kind of supports our hypothesis where we want more diversity there to help suppress weeds. And we see that with cover crop, weeds, and overall plant diversity. Now, so that's all within our one season. What about the effect, the carryover effect of some of these cover crops on our subsequent barley and soybean crops? So this is only 1 year's worth of data. We only have one season of yield right now. But what we have here is on the x-axis is the Simpsons Index of diversity in the previous year. So that's in the cover crop year. And then we've got, weed biomass in our barley crop. So that's in the next year. And we see again kind of the same relationship, where as we move towards a situation of less diversity, we get a really rapid increase in how much weed biomass is there. And that holds for overall plant diversity. Cover crop diversity as well. Weed diversity seems to be forming a different relationship where we have the most weed biomass at kind of middling levels of diversity. But I think when we combine cover crops with that and you see that relationship with overall plant diversity, that cover crops might be overriding the weed diversity that's there. So cover crop diversity may be more important than weed diversity at suppressing weed biomass. So just to summarize, grow diverse, vigorous cover crop mixtures. Weed biomass declines as cover crop biomass increases. So you get a vigorous cover crop there, you're going to suppress weeds. But there's kind of more to this. Weed biomass declines as plant diversity increases. So if you plant a more diverse cover crop, you might have an even greater effect than if you planted that single cover crop in a monoculture. And we're starting to see a carryover effect of the diversity on weed suppression. So we're getting not just an in-season effect, but a carryover effect onto the next season. And this is, as we introduce it's all about selection pressures. And as we introduce different selection pressures through more diverse cover crops, diverse management tactics, we're going to increase weed diversity as well. And so you're going to, it's kind of like a positive feedback loop here, where we might continually get more weed suppression as we increase diversity in our system in management tactics and biodiversity. So yeah, more diversity equals more weed suppression. So if we go to our weed management toolbox, pre-plant, post-plant, tank mixtures, crop rotation, cultivation, I'd probably say we should probably put plant diversity in there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Ryan, on his last slide, talked about radish and mixing radish with barley. That would sort of follow along with some of what you're saying, that diversify the mixture and you're going to get better.
Yeah, that seems to be what we're finding. Instead of just having them in isolation, when you mix them together, we might get kind of an enhanced, like a synergistic effect there.
Any questions for Andrew? One here.
Andrew, I guess a hypothetical question. If weeds were so important in our biological systems, why would we not encourage farmers to grow really good crops clean and free of weeds and pay them to grow a little patch of weeds that would be available for the birds in the winter?
Yeah, that's a good, so having like a refuge there for them. Yeah, and there's some work looking at like landscape complexity, whereby introducing things like hedgerows, you can provide those. So instead of having them necessarily in your field, maybe if you have them just along the hedgerows, and I think most things that I've read, it doesn't matter how far away those hedgerows are. There is obviously a limit, but I think you can get the same benefits up to like 200 meters from a hedgerow into a field from some of the things that I've seen. So that's probably a more appetizing strategy for producers, to tell them, keep some weeds in your hedgerows instead of telling them keep weeds in your fields. But yeah, both I think would be good.
Something to keep in mind for the next CAP program, isn't it? Thank you,
Thank you.
Andrew. Our